So we are very interested about water on Mars, and why? What's the basis for our interest in water on Mars? What was that first?
Everything that's living needs water.
Okay, water is very much, if we're interested in life, we've got to be interested in water. Jeffrey, were you gonna?
Yeah.
Were you gonna say that? Okay. So one aspect of why we're interested in water is the question of life on Mars. And follow the water has for a long time been the catchphrase for NASA's mission planning around Mars. It's changing a little bit with the Curiosity mission. Why else would we be interested in water on Mars?
It could explain, if we were to find water, it would explain, it would be able to explain a lot more of the, like, landforms on Mars.
Okay. So water is an important geological process, and so if we want to understand Mars as a planet, we want to understand what's going on with water. There's another huge area of interest in water on Mars.
What can we do with it?
Yeah, I mean, if we plan to visit the planet every year, it would be nice if we didn't have to carry along several tons of water every time we go, right? And so when we're on Mars, we'll need water, and we don't want to ship it from the Earth. What will we use water for on Mars besides drinking?
Probably clean the planet.
What?
And
Okay, cleaning. There's a lot of industrial processes and so forth that we use water for.
hunting, vegetation growth.
Okay, growing. We're also not going to want to ship tons of food from the Earth. So at some point we will have greenhouses on Mars, and we'll be growing food, and we'll need water for that. Water is also provides the basis for great rocket fuel. If you take water molecules and split them apart into hydrogen and oxygen, then you can burn the hydrogen and you can go places. Okay, so just a quick recap of what we covered before. You know, Mars is, let's just go straight to this next slide. Mars is a lot colder than the Earth. The atmospheric pressure is less than 1% of what the pressure is on the Earth. And as a result, today we expect to find no liquid water on the surface of Mars. We expect to find no running rivers, no ponds, no oceans. And the reason for that is this figure. Okay. So this is maybe a complicated figure, but let's just break it down a little bit. What's plotted along the x-axis here? Temperature. Okay, so we've got temperatures ranging from, well, let's start here in the middle. We've got 0 degrees centigrade, 0 degrees Celsius. What temperature is that?
Freezing.
It's a freezing point of water that we normally experience. We've got, 100 degrees Celsius, 200 degrees, 300 degrees, and so forth. So temperatures getting hotter and hotter the further we go to the right. And then these are all below freezing temperatures. Okay. So cold here and hot here. And what's displayed along the y-axis? Pressure. Okay. So this pressure right here is our normal air pressure at sea level. Okay. And these are increasingly, each mark here goes up by a factor of 10. So these pressures build up quite rapidly as you go up in the scale, and then as you go down the scale, we get pressures that are lower and lower and lower than our standard atmospheric pressure. So we sort of live in our day-to-day experience kind of in this range here. Most of you probably spend most of your time at regular air pressure. I don't imagine any of you, do any of you go deep sea diving? No? What? Okay. Even when we're flying an airplane and the atmospheric pressure outside is much lower, we're still inside the cabin. So what this diagram shows is how these combinations of temperature down here and pressure over here influence the state of water. And it's easiest to see this by, let's say, it was a month or two ago, and it was 20 degrees Celsius outside, which is, 20 degrees Fahrenheit outside, which is, maybe minus 5, 10 degrees Celsius, and there was snow all over the ground. Okay, that snow represents basically frozen water, right? As temperatures warm up, what happens to that frozen water when you reach the 0 degrees Celsius? It'll start to melt. And you go above that particular temperature at that pressure, you get into this region where liquid water is around. And if you take the temperature of water and increase it above 100 degrees Celsius, what happens to it? Turns into a gas, turns into steam. Okay, so this is kind of our normal existence. That's why we see, if we boil water in a tea kettle, we see the steam coming out. We experience water vapor. We experience liquid water in this intermediate range. If we pull ice cubes out of the freezer, we experience solid water. The atmospheric pressure on Mars is just slightly under 1% of the atmospheric pressure here on the Earth. It varies with latitude or with elevation. So it's a little bit higher atmospheric pressure in some of the low-lying areas like Hellas Basin. Lower atmospheric pressure on higher elevation places like Tharsis Mons. But in general, let's say we're operating around here on Mars. And we took some ice that was very cold and let it warm up. What's going to happen to that water in that ice as it warms up? It'll go straight into water vapor in the atmosphere. Okay. So just out and about on Mars, we generally don't have atmospheric pressure high enough for liquid water to exist on the surface. Okay. So this diagram here, basically it's known as the phase diagram for water. Other materials like carbon dioxide would have their own phase diagram showing how combinations of temperature and pressure result in the carbon dioxide being solid or gases or gaseous, or in some cases liquid. But this is the situation we're dealing with on Mars. I mean, if the atmospheric pressure were a little bit higher, we could actually expect to see some liquid water out on the surface of Mars. But given the way it is now, we either see water ice or water vapor.
At what elevation of Mars would you be at a higher pressure?
Well, if you are down in the down at the bottom of Hellas Basin, for example, you might
Could maybe cross that threshold.
Yeah, you might be able to every now and then see some small pockets of liquid water on the surface. But that water, because the air is so dry, that water is going to evaporate very quickly. Okay. Which is why we expect to see this on Mars. dry, dusty, sandy, rocky, not clearly very much of an oasis for us anyway. This is the Viking 2 landing site. You can see where they dug up some samples of the regolith or soil for testing, but it's not a very hospitable, promising environment for for organisms that like to have water around.
If like a human goes on Mars, like what would the suit have to have, like, so they won't die?
Spacesuits in general are basically, you need to consider them like your own private spaceship. Okay? So all of the environmental services that we get for free here on the Earth have to be essentially provided by your suit or your habitat. When humans go to Mars, we will be living for a long time in essentially tin cans that maintain a bubble of Earth-like environment around us. So what would our life support systems have to provide us? Oxygen, which we get for free here on the Earth. Water, which is maybe not free, but fairly abundant. Appropriate pressure, yeah. Okay, so your spacesuit, on Mars we'll be able to deal with suits that aren't the same kind of bulky things that that they use on the International Space Station where they're going out in the vacuum of space. There is some pressure on Mars. But, if you were out without a suit on the surface of Mars, the fact that the air pressure is less than 1% of what we're used to here on the Earth would not be good. Okay? So, a suitable pressure, right mix of gases, water, life support's also going to have to provide food, which ecosystems here on the Earth provide for free. So, the environment, the ecosystems that we've evolved in provide lots of what are called ecosystem services for us that are going to be lacking when we go to Mars. And we're going to have to either replicate them all inside our habitats, or, and I think we'll have time to talk about this a little bit, change Mars to have it provide some of these services for us. Okay. So I want to go back a little bit to the Mariner missions. Remember what an eye-opener was when Mariner 9. Okay. The view of Mars after Mariner 4, 6, and 7 was essentially mostly dead, arid, not interesting planet, and then Mariner went into orbit, saw all these interesting things, and only a couple of which I want to focus on that deal with water. Okay. So one of the features, and we've probably mentioned this before, but I want to go into more detail, that was seen as far back as the Mariner missions, the Viking missions. Orbiters since then have been these valley networks. Okay, so this is an image looking down. I actually can't tell whether this is a Viking or Mariner 9 image. But what do you see now that you've had some more experience interpreting these images from orbit?
River connections, like river network.
What do you observe? River is kind of an interpretation.
I see streams.
Streams is an interpretation.
See lines,
You see these linear features.
maybe signs of erosion.
Okay. Erosion, maybe that's but we certainly, by lines, are you talking about these things?
The water channels,
Yeah.
they look like veins.
They look like veins. They are these linear features. There's some over here too.
Aren't they more like
Well, that gets into how do we interpret them. So let me just write down a couple of observations here. We do see these linear features. How would you characterize those linear features? What's distinctive about their arrangement, for example? They're all
Like connected.
connected, mushed together, branching. Okay. So a more formal term for this would be they're dendritic, kind of like tree branches like. Although dendrites also refer to branching structures coming off of the nerve cells in your brain, but that kind of branching structure is clearly evident here. What can you say about the topography that this is in? First of all, what direction is the light coming from in this image?
The right.
The top.
We've got left, right, and top so far.
Like top right.
Because if you look at the shadows are pointing down.
Okay, let's focus on this crater in particular. You can see that this rim is casting a shadow into the crater, and this rim is being lit up on the inside. So yeah, clearly the light's coming from this direction. That shadowing helps us to pick out these linear features. We've got some. I mean, this is clearly some kind of ridge structure. So this branching system seems to be in between these two higher elevation ridges. The branches collect together and they appear to be exiting this area to the lower right. What would you want to know about the slope of this location?
Well, based on that bottom area, I guess it kind of looks like it's like flowing in between these ridges here.
Yeah, so
It's
this
like depression, so I guess that's where the water would have to go. Whatever.
water or whatever.
Be blood.
Okay. So if we had elevation data, we would probably want to know is this higher elevation? I mean, given that it's kind of continuous with some of this area up here, we might expect that this is a higher elevation up here, going down to a lower elevation gap that's going between those structures. Now, in terms of interpretation, it's been very difficult for you all not to say river. Okay, so that's clearly one interpretation. Now, is there any water in this structure? No, so it's clearly not a river now. Could have been. Okay, so one interpretation was that this was an ancient river channel, like on this scale, maybe kind of like the Mississippi or Ohio River with all of its tributaries, so that branching would kind of represent what we would expect from a branched tributary system. And when Mars's water went away wherever it went, it left the channels behind. But there are other interpretations that we can make as well. What else could carve these channels? Lava. What else? Glaciers. So not a flowing river, but flowing rivers of ice. What else could erode? Okay, then maybe it's wind erosion. I mean, if we have billions of years of the winds blowing across Mars, maybe they could. We know the atmosphere of Mars is mostly carbon dioxide. And on the Earth, and currently on Mars, you can't get liquid carbon dioxide, but if for some reason the air pressure was really high in the past, you could actually get liquid carbon dioxide. But that's something we can kind of rule out very quickly. Okay. So again, I want you to focus on the difference between the actual observations and then how do we interpret them. So if this was a river channel, we would certainly hope that the elevation gradient is as we described. If instead this is being carved by wind, is there any reason necessarily that this would have to be lower elevation down here? No, because the wind could carve things uphill. Okay? Glaciers generally tend to flow downhill as well. Okay, here's just some more examples of valley networks. So these structures were identified early, as soon as we had Mariner 9 in orbit, and they're given the name of valley networks. They are networks of valleys, so that's, hopefully you can remember that. But the key characteristic features here are these dendritic branching patterns, mostly, and channels that would be on the order of what we would expect for something being carved out by a river. They're not all as heavily branched as what I showed you in the first couple of figures. This is Nergal Vallis, again a valley system. Do you see any dendritic branching here? Some, but it's clearly much more reduced than what we saw in the other figures.
Could that say something about like the gradient of the area? Maybe it's steeper.
Interesting question. Maybe if this has a steeper gradient, there is more of a channelization of the erosion, whether it was river or wind or what. Well, let's say river. So that could be part. We'll look at some other explanations as well.
Wouldn't it make more sense for it to be wind if the river or the river bed was going uphill? Because, like, I would assume that the bottom of the hill would have more erosion from the wind than the top of the hill if the wind is coming like this.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. If these were actually wind-carved structures, and I'm going to later say they're not, what direction would the erosion be taking place? Would it be going upstream or downstream? Is a good question. But by and large, these have been fairly well adopted interpretation of them being as a result of water in one format or another. We'll talk about some of the different ideas that could be part of that, though. Okay, the other main apparently water-related feature that was seen early from orbit are these structures called outflow channels. So here is a fairly classic situation. We have this part, let's get it show up better. We have this upstream area where the whole landscape seems to have collapsed. Very early, even actually in the Mariner 6 and 7 missions, there were some examples of what is called this chaotic terrain, where you see these features that are inside this collapsed area. What do those look like to you?
Cottage cheese.
Cottage cheese, okay. Chunks of stuff. Okay. These are a random array of boulders and chunks of rock and so forth. Kind of what you would expect is if the whole area just kind of collapsed and large parts of it were eroded away. And then downstream, you see these channels that don't have the kind of dendritic branching we see in the valley networks. They are very, very much wider than valley networks. And they also associated with these outflow channels, you see these kinds of teardrop-shaped structures around obstacles that are in the environment. So, what's your interpretation of this teardrop feature here? How might this have formed?
It looks like a tree fell.
Looks like a tree fell on it? How?
Like the inside of a tree, like you see the hole that they carved in cartoons. I don't know.
Okay. I think we can rule out trees, though.
Okay.
Could this be like oddly specific wind erosion? You can kind of see the layers and whatever was eroded towards the top.
Okay, so clearly there's a lot of erosion that has gone on here.
See the one of the ridges of this, I think it's a crater. Maybe that caused some sort of barrier.
Yeah, we've
It
got
kinda
the
does look like an aerodynamic kind of thing going on.
we've got the crater, and you can actually, if we blow this up a bit, you can see that there is crater ejecta from the impact of the crater on the one side, but that ejecta is missing on the other side. So what's our interpretation of that?
Came before it was all eroded. Right. Like the crater happened before.
Okay. Crater was there, it had ejecta all the way around like a typical good crater should have. And then something happened to scour the landscape, essentially. Okay? And what direction would that scouring have taken place? Up, okay. So whatever is coming along is hitting this front side of the crater. It is scouring away the crater ejecta on that side, and then it gets diverted around and scours the landscape and leading to this kind of streamlined shape below, and it does not touch the ejecta rim, the ejecta blanket that's on the other side of the crater. It could be wind, but the interpretation here is just massive outflows of water. Okay. Like hundreds or thousands of times the flow of the Mississippi River, all rushing down the landscape within the space of days or weeks. Here's just another example of this. This is Kasai Vallis. It's plural, it's Valles, not Vallis, because there are multiple branches of these channels. You can again see some of the perhaps a little bit more chaotic and then streamlined terrain over here. This is actually a JMARS image. You might recognize it from when we did the Crater Lab, this kind of layout. Here is a bigger scale view of Kasai Vallis. Basically, we've got this area where the flood apparently originated, and as it rushes along the landscape, it's going to cut out these gouges. And you can see the other feature that is common in these outflow channels is the fact that you get multiple channels that are kind of breaking apart from each other and coming back together, you get this braided kind of channels, which you might have seen, I don't know, with, well, there are places you might have seen it, like a river coming into a lake area or a delta, or Mississippi River Delta, where you've got these channels breaking off and coming back together. Here's just another one, Hebrus vallis, same kind of thing. We've got these large channels being cut into the landscape, and again, this kind of braided formation. So the valley network systems are displayed here in yellow. Are they in the northern hemisphere or southern hemisphere? Southern hemisphere. Southern hemisphere is that older or younger parts of Mars? Older, okay. So we find the valley networks in the old southern highland terrain. And the red are the outflow channels. And you tend to find them at the boundary between high elevation to low elevation areas. So here we have southern highlands draining into the northern lowlands. Here we've got southern highlands draining into Hellas Basin, so forth. And they're not quite as old. And so if we go back to our ages of Mars, we tend to find all of the valley networks being in very old Noachian areas, and outflow channels extending into the Hesperian middle age of Mars. Okay. So what I want you to do now is, hold on here.